Welcome, everyone. We'll just take a minute for people to come in and virtually settle in, I guess. My name is Cheryl Court, and I'm with the Coalition for Smarter Growth, and we are excited to bring you this program. We work a lot on making the case for walkable, inclusive, transit-oriented communities and something that everybody has an opportunity to live in. And so obviously, we're all pretty concerned about how housing is a huge issue, not only for people at very low incomes, but really sort of creeping up the income range. And so we were really excited that two reports were recently released by related that were backed by the state of Maryland. And so we're going to hear about those reports and we have the opportunity to hear directly from the public officials and the research teams who are behind those two important reports. And so I wanted to actually hand it off to my colleague, Carrie Kosicki, the Maryland Advocacy Manager, who will give us a little more background and we'll hand it off to our moderator. Carrie?
Hi, welcome all. Thanks for coming. So I'm going to be our kind of tech guru today. If you have any questions or having any issues with video or audio, you can hover over my little Zoom screen. You'll see three dots in the corner, and you can just hit that and send me a message to let me know. Um, we are going to have a question and answer section at the end, moderated by Scott Gottbret from DHCD. So close to the end of the webinar, I am going to turn on the Q&A function and you'll be able to send us questions that we will be able to ask our panel. So like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to message me. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Scott Gottbret, who's joining us today from DHCD, where he's the Assistant Secretary for Policy, Strategy, and Research. Scott, take it away. Glad to have you.
Great. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm actually down in Washington, D.C. today at a 50-state gathering of the heads of national or of housing council or housing finance agencies, about 100 yards from the HUD building. And it just drives home the urgency of today's conversation. It took me 2.5 hours to get here today. I live in Baltimore City, in a neighborhood that is renowned for being the place where young people with tattoos go to have children. And my family, on a personal note, tried to move closer to my work, which is down just along the DC Beltway. The commute times after the Key Bridge collapse skyrocketed from about an hour and 15 minutes to close to 2 hours each way. That was meaning I was about 4 hours in the car. And my wife and I watched as home prices escalated and the homes that we've been looking at originally increasingly became out of reach for our family's financial bottom line. We couldn't make it pencil. We love our neighborhood. We're there to stay. But our story is one that is, reflected in households across the state. One of the highlights from the Maryland State Housing Needs Assessment, which the researchers at the University of Maryland National Center for Smart Growth undertook to complete, the key finding was that in the year 2000, 75% of households in Maryland could afford the median priced home. Today, that number is less than half. 49% can afford the median priced home, and that story has affected my family and tens of thousands of families across Maryland. Before we jump into the speakers, just a couple of trends I want to point out as we get to the findings of these reports. There's some overarching trajectories that I think unify the findings. One insight of the Moore-Miller administration is that we should be data-driven and hard-led, which is, I think, such a wonderful expression that I might make that the tattoo that makes me qualified to live in my neighborhood. These reports speak to each other, and that's because these agencies are speaking to each other. These institutions are speaking to each other. There's a real focus now in Maryland government and in Maryland institutions to focus on what's getting in the way of housing, not an overemphasis on process. And so some of the common themes that we'll see, and background and context that's relevant for today's discussion is that affordability is taking center stage nationally. The recent elections in Virginia, New Jersey, and New York, affordability is a key issue, and it's driving conversations at household tables across the country. It will certainly be front and center of national election conversations as we get into that season. And so that's an overriding theme that everyone is talking about these days, and why today's conversation is so relevant to so many. The second is that a book called Abundance has gained notoriety, and there's actually an abundance movement that folks are talking about. And this is the notion that that supply is essential to many of the things that drive justice issues, like building an energy infrastructure capable of handling the climate crisis in the coming years. or housing justice, requiring the creation of more supply in order to bring down prices so folks can afford to stay in the neighborhoods they live in. And similarly, at the national scale, we see a war on data. We see census data being taken down. We see climate data being taken down. And so today's conversation, I think, pushes back on or centers many of those struggles that so many of us are dealing with on the daily. We have a fantastic panel today of some of the leading thought on some of the key thought leaders in the state, some of the leading experts in this field. So in no particular order, our first speaker today will be Kate Howell, who is Dr. Kate Howell is the director of the National Center for Smart Growth at the University of Maryland. Her focus areas include affordable housing preservation and tenant protection. Her book, Affordable Housing Preservation in Washington, D.C., is available online and at major retailers. And I should note that prior to her current role at the University of Maryland National Center for Smart Growth, she worked at the Washington, D.C. Department of Housing and Community Development, also Maryland Housing and Community Development. Our second speaker, Danny DiPietro, is the Policy Research Director at the Office of Comptroller of Maryland. She was previously the Legislative Director and Chief of Staff for then Delegate Brooke Learman. Her early career focused on health, and she has a master's degree in public policy from Tulane. And last but surely not least is Montgomery County Council President, Natalie Fanny Gonzalez, who has been in Montgomery County Council since 2021. Prior to that, she was the vice chair of the Montgomery County Planning Board. Much of her work focuses on small business, infrastructure, and other critical planning topics. So just a tremendous panel to speak to today. Without further ado, let's jump into the data and understand these reports. So I'm going to hand it first to Dr. Kate Howell, who will detail some of the findings of the Maryland State Housing Needs Assessment 2025 update. Take it away.
Great. Thanks, Scott. I'm going to go ahead and share here. Try to not get, all right, slideshow and everything. Great. Well, so I get I think this is going to be a pretty data heavy day, and I think that's probably okay. Maybe that's what you signed up for. I sure hope so. But if you fast forward through what Danny and I have to say, then you'll actually get to hear something interesting from the Montgomery County Council President. But I'll take it away here a little bit. So we worked on this 2025 State Housing Needs Assessment around this time last year, and it really built on the knowledge of the needs assessment we started in 2020 with enterprise community partners. And 2020 highlighted two critical issues, right? Maryland had a shortage of affordable housing for those making less than half of the area median income. And we had insufficient production to meet both the demand for market and below market housing. And I would love to say I had a different story, and I would love to say that things have changed, but unfortunately, we've made little progress. This report we did had three sections that was looking at the affordability gap, land use questions, and the impact for seniors. And the TLDR, as my associate director uses a lot, the state needs nearly 600,000 new homes to accommodate both existing and new households by 2045. That's a tall order. And although the need is both in rental and home ownership across the income spectrum, the need is most acute at the lowest income rental market. The pace of construction cannot meet the demand. The current pace that we're working at now cannot meet the demand. And more importantly, the way we've got our land use set up, the land use itself is not going to meet the demand. So we actually have to do something different across the state. So I'm going to start a little bit with the housing gap analysis. Incomes fell in real terms by about 1.1% since 2000. And so that has a huge impact on the cost burden, or how much you're paying for rent. If you're cost burdened in housing, that means you're paying more than 30% of your income for housing costs, right? So that's for renters or homeowners. 45% of Maryland renters are cost burdened, with higher cost burdens for non-white renters. You can kind of see in this map here where the concentrations of high cost burdens are, right? It's not too surprising to see things going on in the DC metro area, but it's worth noting that out on the Eastern Shore, we are seeing significant renter cost burdens as people are sort of having to fight for housing with short-term rentals, vacation rentals, and others, and then the zoning is not going to keep up with that. For senior renters, actually, 20% 23% of Marylanders, 65% and older rent. And 55% of senior renters statewide are cost burden for housing. Right. And as you see kind of where this is concentrated in Prince George's County and some of Southern Maryland, a little bit on the Eastern Shore, but it's a little less uniform for seniors. But cost burdens aren't limited to renters in Maryland. 23% of homeowners in Maryland are cost burdened, and that sort of pencils out to 18% of white homeowners compared with 27% of Black homeowners and 29% of Hispanic homeowners, respectively, right? And so we are seeing sort of an inequality in how that shakes out, which means that leaves you less money to maintain your home. And often those are in homes that for lower income buyers are often not as new, right? And so you have a lot more existing maintenance issues to come along with. So the bottom line, this is kind of showing what we're missing. We've got a statewide shortage of 610 available and affordable homes for every 1,000 extremely low income renters. And those are those earning less than 30% of the area median income. Put another way, we only have 300 affordable and available homes for every 1,000 low income renters who need them. But people are living somewhere, right? And so this is how it tracks back to that map that we just talked about. That means that people are paying more for their rent than they should be, right? Because there's not enough available homes. And so if you think about what that means at each income level, if you are, at below 30% of the area median income, you're maybe renting in a place that's affordable to somebody at 50% or 60%, which means you're sort of seeing that what you've got left at the end of the month dwindle smaller and smaller. We see also larger gaps for homeownership, right? And I think I want to go back to what Scott introduced, and I was going to say that one myself, but that in 2000, nearly 75% of Maryland households could afford a median home. And by 2022, that was less than half. And so that means that homeownership is increasingly out of reach for Marylanders across the spectrum. But we got to kind of think a little bit about where the levers are and what does this mean for what we can do. So shifting to housing production and zoning capacity, it's important to set the larger context, right? Nationally, housing production has not recovered from the 2009 financial crisis. So you can kind of see there, we really peaked in 2005. And with the financial collapse, we really stopped producing housing. And on this graphic, right, the single family is in the blue, multifamily is in the red, with the total production in purple on the top. And we had a slight bump nationally for multifamily. And I think maybe a lot of people feel like multifamily is just everywhere because we're finally actually producing some. That's pretty concentrated in certain places. And then more importantly, like you see that single family production never really recovered at all. And so with that drop, if we kind of kept going where we were, we probably could start to make a dent, but we really dropped in production and have never really recovered. So that's pretty key. And the picture looks very similar for Maryland. So this is the Maryland data that we have, right? Housing production's not kept pace with demand. If you're looking at population in the green, it kind of goes that straight line up. Our total production is down, does not meet that demand, and you can see in certain places, in multifamily has only increased marginally, led really by the DC and Baltimore area. Southern Maryland has also seen an increase in multifamily that reflects the overall sort of growth in that region. And we also looked at sort of echoing the national trends. Yes, we have seen a slowdown. Yes, that's sort of a national problem related to the costs of labor and land and all these sorts of things. But Maryland has had some particular challenges, and this kind of looks at the average zoning restrictiveness by state. So we have really restrictive development environment vis-a-vis our neighbors. So this may be certain different things, right? It could be some health and safety things, like we think about the health of the bay, and so there's a lot of prohibitions on construction within the buffer zone, right? And so we like that, though that's really important, but other forms can slow down the permitting process and make it more expensive to build. And sort of you have to balance that need for housing with the need for regulation. And this is, I apologize for this graphic. It's really insane, but it's I'll tell you the short thing. We have a gap in the appropriately zoned land to meet the demand, right? So almost 2,000 acres of land across the state would need to be rezoned to high density to meet the demand through 2045. And this assumes that just current patterns continue, right? The way that that people have been moving and wanting to be are exactly how they're going to be moving forward. But as we know, that's not necessarily the case. People are living in rental housing longer. People are moving more. Young people are moving into urban areas. And so we have to think about, we can only get so far. We can't keep commuting out, right? There's only so far you can go. Scott's experience of taking 2 hours and back and forth is it's not really what people are looking for. And you can only go so far. We aren't building new highways. We aren't building extremely new rail lines. And so we have to think about how we zone for areas that are closer in to get people on shorter commutes and closer to amenities and walkability. And so this really leads us to think both about land use and subsidy. While opening up land through density can't solve all problems of affordability, particularly for households earning less than 50% of AMI, area median income, without appropriate zoning for the construction of those buildings, we're going to be stuck. You can have all the subsidy you want, but if you can't build it because the land won't allow it, we aren't going to be able to move forward. And so I think this is a really key piece, is that we've got to start thinking about how our land use intersects with our subsidy and our other resources. And I'll stop there. I probably talked too long, but thanks for not calling me out.
Actually, you were right on time. So congratulations. That's a real skill to master. And yeah, thanks so much for your observations about commute times just being unsustainable. One of my favorite/least favorite data points from the Maryland Association of Realtors this year is that something close to 43% of young renters are considering leaving the state due to high housing costs. And on their way out of the state, they often cite long commute times. And this is just really driving a lot of population transformation within the state. And I think that tees up perfectly to bring on Danny DiPietro, who is the Policy Research Director at the Office of the Comptroller of Maryland. Their recent report, part of the State of the Economy series, is called Housing and the Economy from October 2025. So I'm going to throw it over to you, Danny. Take it away.
Thank you. Does my screen look okay to everyone?
Looks great.
Okay. Perfect. I hope I can be as timely as Kate. That was awesome. So I'm Danny DiPietro, Policy Research Director at the Comptroller's Office. As Scott said, great to be here with you all. I'll just set the context a little bit first for why the Comptroller's Office is in this conversation. So I'm part of a new team that the Comptroller created when she took office, and we do sort of economic analysis and produce economic research so that the public and policymakers and business leaders can have more information about the headwinds and tailwinds and sort of health of our economy, and what might help it grow. So this publication is part of a series that stems from our State of the Economy report that we published back in 2023. And a key finding of that report was that population growth has been slowing in Maryland since the financial crisis in 2008. And domestic outmigration appeared to be a big part of the problem, sort of dragging on our population growth. That is more people moving out of Maryland to other states than are moving into Maryland from other states. So this report, the 2023 report, suggested that domestic migration was becoming more closely tied to affordability and cost of living nationally, which was a reversal of historical norms when people moved to the productivity centers that were more expensive. And so we wanted to take a deeper look at those two things. This report explores the relationship between domestic migration trends and housing costs as the top driver of cost of living for most people in Maryland specifically, and then discusses the factors that are inhibiting housing supply and driving up prices. I'll just say that over the course of this report, we did a ton of quantitative data analysis that you'll see, and also spoke to over 200 developers and local government representatives, state government, et cetera, in roundtable discussions and one-on-one meetings to try to get a really holistic view of this issue. So I will jump into what we found. First, domestic outmigration, we sort of confirmed, is a problem, and it's getting worse. So this figure shows the net loss of residents from Maryland each of the past 12 years. This adds up to about 300,000 residents that we've lost since 2010. That's about 2.3 million moved out and 2 million moved in, just domestic, so from other states. Overall, the state's population did still grow during this period due to a combination of international immigration into Maryland and net natural population growth. So births exceeded deaths. But outmigration does create a strain on the state's finances in the form of lost tax revenue, fewer workers, et cetera, which really brings the comptroller's office to the table. So then we took a look at sort of who these folks are that are leaving and where they're going. So the next two slides tell us more about that net outmigration group. So the 300,000 residents that we lost since 2010. So first, they are primarily coming from DC, New York, New Jersey, and they are primarily moving to, and this is in order of the sort of the number of people that go to each of these states: Florida, the Carolinas, Pennsylvania, Texas, Florida, West Virginia, Virginia, Delaware. Then we took a look at the age and income brackets of these folks that are leaving. So the left chart on your left shows age group, and chart on your right adjusted gross income. This is IRS data. So prior to we disaggregated this data by sort of pre-pandemic and post-pandemic to see if there were trends and changes in patterns. And we did notice two really important shifts. So first, prior to the pandemic, which are the blue bars, Maryland primarily lost on the net basis older, higher income residents. And sorry, I'm just realizing I should keep on my chat here. Okay. You guys looked frozen and I got nervous for a second, but I think we're good. So prior to the pandemic, we lost primarily older and higher income residents, many retirees. Since the pandemic, represented by these yellow bars, we are losing a far greater share of younger and lower middle income residents compared to pre-pandemic. The breakout now is about 50-50, older, higher income, and low to middle income, younger, whereas pre-pandemic, it was like 75% older, higher income residents. So this sort of confirms to us that cost of living is having an increasing effect on migration decisions in Maryland, as that national research suggested a few years ago. And to dive deeper, then we took this data and looked at housing costs. Again, the greatest factor in cost of living for most people. So the next few slides here look at this state cohort, states we're gaining residents from, states we're losing residents to, compared to Maryland on housing costs. So the light blue bars on all the next few slides are the states we gain residents from. The dark blue bars are the states we lose residents to. And you'll see there's this waterfall effect, as Scott has dubbed it, where there's really close alignment. The states we are gaining residents from tend to be more expensive, have more expensive housing than Maryland, and the states we lose residents to tend to have less expensive housing than Maryland. So I'm going to just show you a few examples of that alignment. I will note Florida is often an outlier, which doesn't surprise us because we are still 50% of the people we are losing are still in that higher income bracket and are older. So we know there are other factors in addition to costs like weather and age and tax sensitivity. But again, there's clearly a increasing cost of living is clearly sort of becoming an increasingly important factor for folks. So the first one here is just median home sale price. As you'll see, most of the states we gain residents from have more expensive for sale housing than Maryland, and then the states we lose residents to have a lower median home sale price. In addition to the cost of buying a home, of course, there's a cost of financially maintaining a home. So mortgage, real estate taxes, insurance, utilities, et cetera. Again, you see perfect alignment here with the migration trends. With median gross rent, it's the same story. More affordable to rent in most of the states that we lose residents to. And finally, when we compare median wage in each state to the median wage needed to rent a two-bedroom apartment, that alignment is right on track with migration trends again. where we're gaining from the states that have a higher gap there and losing to states where it is more affordable to rent based on median wage. So why is there this misalignment, or why is housing more expensive in Maryland than these other states? First, because of Econ 101, we looked at supply and demand, and because we know when demand exceeds supply, costs typically go up. So I'll be really quick on this because Kate covered it, but we looked at 3 indicators of that supply-demand mismatch, or 3 indicators that sort of demonstrate we have a supply-demand mismatch in Maryland. That was the levels of inventory, the healthy level of inventory, and the healthy level of vacancy or homes that are available for rent or sale, and compared that to the level in Maryland. So both inventory and vacancy indicate that we have below the healthy level of available housing units. And then, of course, there's just the shortage data that Kate covered already. So why don't we have enough housing was sort of our next question. And we looked at supply, and we found that there's just been years of underbuilding. And when we look at our state cohort here, we saw a clear trend. Most of the states with housing that is less expensive than Maryland are increasing their housing stock much more quickly than Maryland is. So since 2000, Maryland has grown its housing stock by about 20%. And most of the states we lose residents to have grown their housing stock by 40% or more in that same time period. This figure shows, and it's my second to last, I believe, the sort of just trend over time. Each individual bar here represents 1 year, and it is the number of housing units permitted per 1,000 residents in each of these states. And we just did that to sort of equalize for differences in population size. So you'll see here that the states that have more affordable housing have been permitting more units per household and have been increasing the pace of permitting over time, whereas Maryland in the yellow bars here has remained relatively stagnant. So we've permitted between 7 and 10 units per 1,000 residents over the past 10 years. And the Carolinas, Texas, Florida have been permitting about 20 units per 1,000 residents in the past 10 years, and that is the rate of permitting has increased. To meet that projected demand number, 590,000 that Kate shared, we'll need to approve nearly 30,000 permits per year. And since 2014, we've permitted an average of 18,000 per year. By comparison, South Carolina, which has a very similar population size to Maryland, permitted 47,000 units last year to our 18,000. So we are lagging there. And my last point, or the last section of the report, looked at the factors that are inhibiting housing supply and driving up costs. So we know that the supply-demand mismatch drives up housing prices in its own right, but then there are additional sort of policy and regulatory factors that we know raise prices as well. The cost to build is high in Maryland compared to other states, in part because of materials and labor, but those are kind of increasing everywhere. So a lot of this comes down to fees and regulations. Nationally, it is estimated that regulations account for about a quarter of home prices, but as Kate shared, Maryland is more highly regulated than most of our neighboring states, and is rated as the 6th most highly regulated state for land use in the nation. So regulation likely accounts for more than a quarter of costs here. So you'll see in the report, this is my last slide, that we took an objective look at the policies and regs that add to project costs and that are passed on to consumers, or that reduce developable land, which also sort of in its own way adds to costs. And we detailed those that sort of jumped out to us in that Maryland was an outlier compared to these other states that we looked at, in the way that we, in our policy or process approach to these issues. And we just want to acknowledge, especially Brooke as a former legislator, the comptroller, each of these policies is well intended and has, good justification in its own right. What we felt like was the problem through our research was just the volume and layering of these state, local, and national regs, and the fact that they don't always fit together, and just sort of the complexity in process that creates, necessitating lawyers and consultants and adding to timelines and adding project costs. So happy to dive into this that discussion more in the Q&A, but I will stop there.
Great. Thanks so much for that summary of your fantastic report. If you all haven't checked it out, I strongly encourage you all to read it. One of the best housing reports I've ever read. I'll be on the record saying that. And I love that insight that was at the bottom of the slide, that folks that are used to working in multiple states refer to Maryland as the Smith Island cake state, due to the dense layers of regulations that culminate in it making it very hard to build housing. Let's talk about that a little bit. I'd love to tag in Montgomery County Council President Natalie Fanny Gonzalez to get your reactions to the data and findings that were presented on the screen. What's going on at the local level, either in terms of regulations or dynamics that's making it hard to build housing?
Thank you so much, Scott, and thank you for the invitation. I love the presentation from Dr. Howell and Danny DiPietro. I think you guys are putting in writing through data what we have been saying in Montgomery County for a while. We even put together an infrastructure task force that is analyzing these issues, especially on fees and things that we should be doing better in Montgomery County to streamline development processes. So I wanted to say that up front. The county council created that task force last year, and they're supposed to give us a report back next year. And it's composed by a mix of government agencies as well as developers. So that's the one thing that I wanted to say. In general, we are dealing with a housing crisis that didn't just came up out of the blue. It's been developing for years. And I think something that it was addressed, I think, was the controller's report. At the end of the day, it's about cost of living, right? We know that young families are leaving Montgomery County, not only because of the housing cost, but because they cannot even afford childcare. If you're a young family with 2-3 kids and you're paying $2,000-$3,000 a month for childcare, and I'm not exaggerating, I have 2 children, and we're paying about $2,000 a month just on childcare. It's just really hard. So many of the things that we're doing on the county council right now is, number one, opening opportunities, opening land use to create more housing. And it has been a very difficult conversation. But it's supposed to be difficult, right? Especially when you're talking about homes. Saying that we all care about affordable housing, yet not doing anything about it is not a solution. Okay, so from master plans that call for modernizing our land use to create more housing, especially near transit, especially near job centers, is key. And second of all, making sure that we're really meeting reality. The idea that everybody wants to live in a small house with a fence, that needs to stop. Right now, we have families that want to see bigger opportunities. Some people want to see more duplexes or live into a triplex. When I was running for office, and this is a true story, I knocked on over 8,000 doors by myself in a year. Number one issue from constituents, from people, everyday people, from people who were born here, from immigrants, low-income people, folks who have PhD. My district is very diverse. It's anything between Forest Glen all the way to Norbeck. I have very, very rich people, and I have low-income folks. Everybody said the same thing. Mike, especially when I was talking to the people, older than 50, they will say, I had a hard, my biggest problem right now is that my children are not able to buy a home, just like I did when I was their age. That's the reality. And we need to humanize the issue and the data, the awesome data that Dr. Howell and Danny put together. People cannot afford to live here. So opening up land use to allow duplexes and triplexes, for example, which is something that we did at the county council recently in a very strategic places. I wanted to go beyond what we said, by the way. But anyway, it's about compromising. So we focus on particular areas near transit. It's about creating opportunity, which is what the 2 presenters talked about with their data. At the same time, besides opening up land use to increase more housing density, allowing more housing density, and what I told you right at the beginning with this task force that we created that is looking into funding infrastructure and regulations that we have in the county that we need to modernize. The other thing that we need to be very mindful for is that when we talk about deeply affordable housing, and I have different projects in my district, people creating housing for people making $30,000, $40,000 a year. That's a great idea, but that costs money. In order for us to make those projects happen, means that the government needs to chip in too to ensure those families can stay here. So that's one thing. The other thing that is highly controversial that was actually my bill is the rent stabilization bill. Why? Yes, we need to increase more density. Yes, we need to modernize land use, but we also need to ensure that we have reasonable caps for rent in the county. So that's why we passed the rent stabilization bill a couple years ago. We're analyzing, but I know that it's making already a huge difference because at the end of the day, we don't want to push out people who live here already. So I think you had to really hit every single aspect from rent stabilization to put those limits in the caps limits for rent increases to opening up land use. I think we need to really be mindful of moving forward policies that help young people to stay in the county, not just to work in the county, but stay in the county and be able to raise a family. And again, I get pushback from certain folks every now and then when I talk about this, but the fact is clear. The data is clear. It's not data that I came up with. We just had two different speakers telling us that we are dealing with a crisis and it takes political will to confront that crisis. Otherwise, what are we getting elected for if we're not going to move forward? So that was my reaction, Scott. I hope you got everything that you needed.
That was fantastic. Thanks so much for that and for all your great work. So I had kind of two questions for you, which I'll roll into one now and let you take a big swing at. There's a famous quote that that I'll summarize by saying, "No plan survives contact with the battlefield." And certainly there is a battle for housing going on in our communities. And so, part A of this question is, you mentioned some of the plans that have been passed, master plans, zoning reforms, et cetera. But how does fractured government mean that those plans, don't see their way to fruition? You see projects getting denied for financing or for variances, or resources being denied or drying up or delays causing price escalations. Projects don't pencil anymore. You have zoning authority in your area vested in one body, and then resources and decision-making vested elsewhere. And we see that across the state. A planning agency inside the executive branch may be at war with a local council is being pressured not to see projects go through, even though the plans call for it. So that's kind of question A, or part A. And then part B is, what about the public input, hearing processes, et cetera, where at the local level seems to really favor folks who don't want to see change, and silence or suppress some of the voices that want to move to that community or are not yet residents in that community, or maybe renters and not available for public hearings. So what is it about our processes, our political processes, our decision making that you're seeing at the local level that makes it hard to build housing, get compromises done? Are we in a vetocracy where anyone who doesn't want housing can block it? How do we muster that political courage in the face of these processes?
I come from the Park and Planning Commission. Let me just start there. I was a vice chair of the planning board. I was there for 7 years, resigned to run for office, and here I am. I made it. I survived. And I ran my campaign on a housing production platform and transportation safety. That's what I did. So this idea that the majority of residents are NIMBYs, it's false. And I proved it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been getting elected. I won with over 56% of the vote in my district in a primary, which is a lot. So people do want to see more housing. Yes, we have a vocal minority that is very loud, but I think the responsibility of elected officials and appointed officials in the Park and Planning Commission needs to be making decisions based on data making sound decisions, not just based on what's happening today, but how we want our future to look like. That's our responsibility. And that's what I take at heart when I make decisions that might not make sense for certain folks, but I know that based on the data, and again, we just had two awesome presentations backing me up here, and I just met these two ladies, by the way. It is making those sound decisions and not being afraid. I don't think you can have people with fear or being afraid of not winning an election making these important decisions. I'm the type of person who I'm very upfront and I say, look, I'm gonna use my voting power to make a difference today. And if for some reason I die tomorrow, at least I die with dignity that I use my power to do the right thing. That's how I'm seeing my position. And yes, the process is not perfect. It's far from the land use process is so complicated, and there's certain things happening, developing for so many years, and it's hard to like reset everything. Especially, it's not just the decision making part, but also the staff. We have had people working in certain positions in the county, both county level and parking planning, which is a bi-county position in Maryland. We have Prince George's and Montgomery County, who have been working there for many years and they're used to do things certain way. And sometimes the arguments are internal, and it's hard to get them to move. But at the end of the day, it's policy making. It's about how can we make sure that we are preparing for the future. This is why we created this task force that I mentioned at the beginning of my remarks, the infrastructure funding task force, to analyze processes on land use and how can we streamline things. The other thing that we're working on with the county executive, although he's very behind, how can we update the MPDU workforce housing laws in Montgomery County to meet reality? These are documents that have not been updated for many, many years. And we were supposed to get the report like 2 months ago. Still waiting for the county executive, but we're gonna keep pushing for that one. But again, understanding that yes, these are hard conversations, but it is our responsibility to confront them and to make sure that we also inform the community. I am very proud of all the community engagement that I personally do in my district. I'm the type of person who gets on the bus with a camera and interviews people and tell them what we're doing on sector plans and so forth. The Vero-Smith Corridor Master Plan that we passed 5 years ago, I was on the planning board. I literally got on the bus and waited on the bus stops to tell people this is what we're doing and this is why. We want to make sure Vero-Smith Road is safe for people to walk, bike, roll, take transit, and drive, and to also increase density so more people can take advantage of this huge transportation infrastructure that is coming in. It was so good that we even got a national award by the what's it called? The National Planning Association. And so you need to be out there and talk to people about it and not make assumptions. The other really amazing thing that we just did, we the council provided funding to the planning department to create the Planning Academy. We're talking about very complicating issues. So the idea is to get, the young generation, civic leaders to join this academy. It's like different trainings for I think it's like 6 months or so, and educating about these concepts because they're hard. So I think at the end of the day, that's what we want to do. Make sure that we have an educated community who understands the planning process, understand that they're not perfect and that we need their help, their feedback to make it better as time goes on. I hope I answered your question. It was a really long question, by the way.
I'll try to be shorter going forward. That's great feedback. So let's bring in our other panelists, and we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes now of discussion among the panel. And then for the audience, we'll turn to Q&A after that. And so you'll have a chance to put your questions in the Q&A, and those will get translated into questions for the panel to react to and answer. So other panelists, you're up. So, one of the things that you just mentioned was, let's not make assumptions about the truth that's out there. You mentioned that people assume that NIMBYs are the majority, but your experience running for office showed that NIMBYs are a vocal minority. And NIMBYs, by the way, stands for not in my backyard type folks who may want to see housing built, but just not anywhere near them, not in their backyard. And so, on this question of assumptions, I'm curious to tag in the researchers and the research teams. Is what are some things that you went into your research efforts sort of assuming at the outset, but then as you got your fingers into the data, you were surprised to discover under the hood? What did the data show you that you weren't expecting, perhaps? Kate, do you want to take a swing at this first?
I was going to look at Danny for that one, but
I'm happy to dive in if you want.
Yeah.
So I think one thing we were surprised by was this like Smith Island cake effect, and the fact that when we did interview, and again we talked to over 150 developers, we sort of expected them to rail on a few specific regulations, and I think the portrayal is that they could be a little heartless when we're talking about the regulations that local and state policymakers have put in place to protect workers, protect the environment. We did not find that to be the case. I think everyone was in agreement that
Danny, we're losing you there. Some reception issues. I don't think it's just me. Everyone else's faces are bobbing. So, Kate, can I throw it over to you while Danny's signal comes back?
Oh, there she's back.
Oh, sorry.
Danny, you were just about to jump into surprising findings when we lost you about 30 seconds ago.
I'm so sorry. Did it catch any of the beginning?
Yes.
No, you might want to just start back over with you were surprised to find.
Sure. Okay. So what I was in our interviews with developers, we were just surprised to find that folks were not so focused on the specifics of the policy or like deterred by the intent, more the complexity of complying with these policies and the process. I think part of it was the way that the patchwork, like of course the state is usually setting the floor, and then a county can choose to just sort of comply with the state baseline or build on a policy, make it more stringent or sort of increase the requirement. I think that makes it really hard to work in different parts of the state. But we also heard, and there's actually awesome Federal Reserve analysis of how this translates into longer project timelines and the need to hire more consultants, like I said earlier, hire more lawyers, because this project that they just did on the Eastern Shore might look extremely different and be a whole different beast to navigate in the National Capital Region. And the part of this that we also found interesting is, in many cases, local government representatives, the folks on the permitting and planning staff, we're complaining about the same regulations as the developer because it's so hard for them to implement, and they're under resourced, and their staff shortages there. So we were surprised by how much actually in common we found, and there was just agreement about the level of complexity and how nobody wants these project timelines to be so long, and no one wants them to be so complicated on all sides of this. So that was something we were surprised by.
Yeah, I actually want to tag on to that because I think the thing that I was actually surprised at the sheer lack of production. So I live in DC, and so and I'm up and around College Park, and I'm going over to Silver Spring for meeting or here and I see construction, I see building, cranes going in the air, and so I think that kind of skews your perspective, right? We all are sort of where see the world through our own sort of experience, and so I think I knew it was a little slow, but I didn't realize it was quite that slow, and that we had really this sort of a long tail of the housing crisis, the 2009, 2008 housing crisis. I think that was actually really surprising to me to think about, just despite what it feels like in the tight, the inner ring of this region, that's not really the norm. Um, and then I think the other thing is that when we looked at the supply of land that is appropriately zoned for demand, again, we're seeing, oh, there's all this upzoning going on. We're doing all these things, but not yet enough, right? And so, like, we're actually oversupplied at land that is zoned for very low density. So we have more land zoned for that than what we need to supply what is needed. Um, and then, we don't have enough at that high and in some places medium density area. And so that actually was surprising to me. And I thought about that also in the context of like a lot of these state level policies, and it's kind of got some things for me to think about, like, well, so what are we doing and how are we thinking creatively at the state level around our land use too, right? Because we have open space goals at the state that we want to preserve the open space. Well, what does that mean that we have to do if we want to, if you want to keep preserving open space, what does that mean about how we have to zone, right? You can't preserve open space if we keep sprawling into that open space because there's no other options. And so I thought a lot about that, and it was kind of, pulling together a lot of pieces around that, the question of commuting, and that we aren't building more highways, as far as I can tell, because they're quite expensive, as we're learning. And our new, we're going to increase mark capacity one day, we hope. Yay, Camden Line, come on. But it doesn't seem to be imminent, and that's a challenge. So we have to build where we've already got infrastructure.
Can I just have one sentence to that? I just thought of one other big surprise for us. The sort of alignment actually between the type of housing that is most sort of environmentally friendly and density. We thought there'd be more pitting sort of the environmental priorities and the type of housing we need, when in fact some great research, including new research out of UC Berkeley, shows that denser housing is more environmentally friendly, and we probably can do more merging of those two issues.
I could have told you that. All you needed to do was call me, and I would have said that to you. Being pro housing means being pro the environment, being sustainable. When you upzone and redevelop a property, you're not just creating more housing there, you're upzoning or modernizing water storm management, for example. That's huge. You are modernizing, you're creating green infrastructure. That's what you're doing. So I had to say that, Scott. I'm
Right.
sorry
And
to interrupt.
right, reduces your need to drive, right? I mean, even in sort of areas that are not close to job centers, if you aren't driving for everything on the weekends, if you can get up in the morning on a Saturday, go get a coffee, take your kids to the park, go to your soccer game, and not have to get in your car, right? The sort of reduction in like, frankly, infrastructure, but also CO2 and all these sorts of other the more hard surfaces, all of those kinds of things. It actually has this kind of like knock-on effect that is really important, frankly.
That's great. A lot of great insights here. And just big takeaway for me in this moment is it's not just having more housing overall, but the density of the housing that we create is significant. Where we build that housing is significant. It matters for the overall effect that it has on the market and opportunities for our residents. One surprising finding that we've encountered is that people see those cranes going up and see the luxury units being built, and they say, see, our priorities are just misaligned. We can build housing. It's just we're not maybe getting enough subsidies into these projects. But our experience has found that those luxury projects are going up because that's the only profit model and financing model that can survive the very complicated processes of appeals and legal battles and zoning and variances and complexity and lawyers and accountants that have to get through it. Is you have to have a very high return on investment project in order to make it worthwhile to go through those. A very surprising finding from the comptroller's report. One of my favorite moments was that the financial institutions are baking the cost of regulations and the uncertainty that comes from Maryland being a late vesting state, meaning that they can change the rules after you've already broken ground or closed financing. The uncertainty that comes from that, the complexity of regulation has meant that financial institutions are baking the cost of Maryland's Smith Island cake into the interest rates that they charge these projects. And that's showing up in the bottom line of how much the rents will be charged for those projects or how much the homes are selling for. Is that gets baked in somewhere, the cost of those delays and the cost of that uncertainty, and that's showing up in the affordability crisis. So great comments there. Next question I have for the group is, what do you think that mainstream discourse and media are getting it wrong about the housing debate or discussion? One of my favorite jokes is about the contact lens people are looking for a contact lens that fell on the ground. There's like 20 people looking for it. And then they say, someone new to the group says, are you sure you lost the contact over here? And they say, no, somebody lost it over there. We're just over here because this is where the light is. And so what's going on like that in the housing space? Where are people focusing their attention, but it may be misdirected? What does media and public discourse get it wrong about the housing battle?
I can jump in first per experience. And I think when we talk about housing, we really need to talk about we are here creating opportunity, okay, and humanizing the issue. What I hear from certain media outlets and even emails that I get is, well, this is an issue. When you're talking about building more housing, they automatically think of helping developers. You're helping the developers. No, that's not what I'm doing. I need developers in the conversation because they're the ones who are actually building the properties, right? So I think this whole idea of demonizing one particular sector is wrong, and we hear from the media and we hear from community members too. When in my view, I think it should be about we need to create more opportunity for people of every single income level and ability, because we haven't even talked about creating properties that are for people who are disabled, for example. That's another type of property. I mean, imagine if you have a wheelchair and being able to get in the bathroom with a wheelchair. So I think as a society, we need to start creating demons and start understanding that we must work with each other to build more deeply affordable housing, to build, yes, housing for the rich, but also housing for every single other person. So that's something that came to my mind when you asked that question, Scott.
I'll take on my favorite one with the preamble that my focus, and I think Scott mentioned this, is preservation of affordable low-income housing, right? And particularly working with tenants who, anyway, all that to say, my favorite one is this idea that if you build luxury housing, it doesn't matter. And like, okay, like it sounds right? Like it's on its face. You're like, yeah, you're just building high income housing. Well, the question is, where do you build it? Right? If you build high income housing in a place where we know there's demand, and how do we gauge demand? We gauge demand by how much the cost of housing is. So we look around the region and we say, wow, home prices are highest over here. Let's build there, right? Because what happens, right? You're looking for a house in the neighborhood that you really, really want, and home prices are off the charts. Well, as a upper middle income person, you go to the next neighborhood over and you're good. Okay, well, then somebody else says, well, I can't quite afford to live there. And they keep leapfrogging. And that's great if you're middle and higher income and you have a lot of choices. But at some point down the income spectrum, you don't have choices. And so if we aren't building housing for people in neighborhoods where we know the demand exists, then people are just going to keep moving. The counterfactual to not building anything is not stasis. It's not staying the same. It is, in fact, actually people are going to move in and raise the prices. And we see that in places where we haven't changed the zoning at all, but home prices are well beyond the incomes of the people who actually live there. So if you own a house, that's awesome. In some ways, you just have gained so much equity on your home, but no one else behind you can come in. And so I think that's one that I think about a lot. Because the region doesn't care where you put housing. It's going to change the regional conversation. We'll be able to say, yep, we put in 600,000 homes across the state of Maryland. But where we do it actually does matter in terms of this question of displacement and who we're building for and how we're building. We need subsidy. And also, we can walk and chew gum at the same time.
I agree with both of the other speakers. I'll cite the notes I had prior were, similar to the council president's comments. I feel like for media, they're always looking for ways to pit people against each other, and it's just not that simple with housing, and it's definitely not the solution. Another thing, I mean, we're policy nerds here, but I feel the simplicity of the supply demand and price discussion is often missing. It really does just boil down to, do we have enough housing to meet demand? And if we did, the price point would come down. There are also policies and regs that would keep adding to housing costs, but solving the supply demand mismatch is a huge part of the puzzle here. I feel that there's also a tendency to throw up hands and point to macroeconomic forces like inflation and sort of labor shortage. And of course, those are issues, but all states are facing those issues, and they are producing much more housing than Maryland. So again, just sort of staying focused. And then finally, it's not. I think it's also a lot about these bigger sort of philosophical questions that we have to answer as a state, and they're challenging about our competing priorities, land preservation, historic preservation, traffic mitigation, character of our community. But they're, finding that balance and having that discussion about like where are we willing to compromise, and what will it take to increase supply, and what can we all agree on? It feels more like the root of the problem than what is people are pointing their fingers at.
I would also like to kind of throw one more in there that's a little bit of a wrench, so why not? It's the joy of being an academic. I get to do that. But this kind of question about, what can we expect in terms of home price declines or rent drops? And this is a really important question, right? Because if you looked at like the coverage, the Wall Street Journal covering Austin, the city of Austin built a mess of housing. If you haven't been to Austin in like 10 years, you'll go and it's unrecognizable, right? The downtown really is. They built so much housing that rents started to drop. The Wall Street Journal reported on this like it was the biggest crisis ever, right? Because what does that mean? Well, you invested in this housing assuming a certain rate of return, and housing prices going down actually kind of messes with that. Well, okay, that's in rental housing, and they'll write down their debt, whatever. But if you're a homeowner, what happens if prices were to go down 10%? Well, we found that out in the 2009 housing crisis, right? And so I think we have to be really careful too about how we talk about this and how we think about this, that in some way, right, we have to be pretty clear we have to be really careful, I think, about our expectations in this, because a lot of people are really dependent on, right? Most people, a home is your primary savings account. And so people are living in their savings account in many ways, which creates a lot of like challenges in terms of this NIMBY question, right? You don't want to put that savings account in jeopardy because you may be planning to retire on that. And so I think we have to be just sort of really careful, because this is very personal for people, but also it's community, right? It's how we house our neighbors. So I think it makes it really tricky. And I think that nuance is often lost in the conversation.
Yeah, that's great. I heard in public hearings, residents, some homeowners specifically saying, we want to protect our investment. We don't want anything to change. And these are the homeowners that have seen their home value go up 40% in a 5-year period, right? So they have a structural incentive to oppose any kind of change that would change the equation on their massively, rapidly increasing investment that the mortgage of which is guaranteed by the federal government. And so, I want to get to audience questions here. One of the first audience questions we got is, what would it take to change this conversation, to change opinions on housing, particularly among homeowners who are wary of new homes going up in their communities, perhaps affecting their skyrocketing property values. Yet those same homeowners saying that their children and grandparents can't afford to live in their communities. There seems to be some cognitive dissonance there. What needs to change for opinions to change, or is this just going to forever be homeowners versus non-homeowners, haves and have-nots?
I just refuse to see it as homeowners are in a no and renters are a yes. I just think that question is way too general. I don't think, from my experience talking to homeowners, when you have a one-on-one conversation and you say, these are the facts, what we want to do is create opportunities for the next generation. And I think at the end of the day, people understand, because you own your home, but you don't own your whole community. Yes, we want people to create spaces where you can have amazing experiences and make communities very vibrant, but that means a collective experience, and that means giving opportunity to somebody else too. So I think we need to stop even asking questions with those assumptions, because it's just I want to make sure that renters feel that they belong. I take the same respect on in terms of their opinions from owners with renters too. There are people who live in this county, and sometimes people they just don't want to buy a home, and that's okay. As long as you are contributing to our community and understanding that if we participate, we make our society better. But that making our society better is not to say, no more. Now I'm here and I just don't want to have anybody else. That's just the wrong way to see things, especially when we are, as a government, investing on more, for example, transportation infrastructure. That's key, right? It's not just the housing. It goes side by side with transportation infrastructure investments. And we haven't even talked about schools. Man, if I start talking about schools here, you might have to turn off my camera, because I do get people who say to me, yeah, Natalie, I understand there's certain places in the county that are more affordable for me to buy a home, but I want to move to that particular neighborhood that has great schools. Well, and this is coming from progressives who don't see themselves as NIMBYs. My response is, if you're a progressive and you really want to see society better, then you shouldn't be worried about that. You should be like, walk the talk. And if you go to a school that has issues, then be that parent who's making sure that the school turns out great for other folks, right? Instead of thinking, oh, I need to move to that neighborhood because the schools are awesome. So I'm walking the talk. And my kids go to a Title I school. I am walking the talk. So, and that's another side that I don't think the reports that we talked about mentioned, but it's so important because it's coming from this very liberal folks. And that's their excuse to oppose housing in certain places. I leave it there for you too.
Great.
Think
Danny,
about.
Kate, anybody want to take a swing at what is it going to take to change opinions on this issue?
I mean, to some degree, I think it's time. You talk to people, and it sounds crazy, but there's a long game activity here that people are changing their views on what neighborhoods look like. And you're like, oh well, yeah, no, I visited my kid who lives in this cute walkable neighborhood, and wow, we went and had dinner out, and we came back to their house, and like they start to realize these are real places. Because I mean, remember, right, our view of what density looks like is incredibly racialized, right? It's incredibly baked in to the ways that cities were framed in the mid-century. And that is inherently based in fears. And I mean, part of the reason why white flight happened in the first place, and then why middle class suburban flight happened. And so we have to be really aware. These are really, frankly, now I would say antiquated ideas about what that means for a neighborhood. And so we have to be, I think in some ways there's like it's a time, is we just keep doing the work. I know that I'm not an elected official, so I can say that, lucky me. But I'll leave that to our council president in Montgomery County and all the other electeds here and elsewhere. But I think that there is some degree of understanding that, as we've seen, right, Greater Washington put out a fantastic poll, and they've been doing on housing, and the majority of people really do support more housing. And so I think we have to remember also, research shows that the people who show up to public meetings are, a lot of them, I mean, God bless, my dad is now one of them, retirees, older, whiter individuals who show up and they have time, right? If you have to deal with childcare and you're navigating 6 other things in a job, it's really hard to show up to a council hearing in the middle of the day. And so we do have to kind of, I think, temper some of this with time and the realities of who we're hearing from.
Yeah, I can conclude on that point first. We could have a conversation about appeal rights and public input rights. Montana just made a policy move to shift all public input on housing to the zoning and comprehensive planning phase rather than project by project input. because they found, to Kate's point, just there wasn't a representative sort of set of opinions that was having an impact on projects. We cited in our report a Yale Law School scholar who notes that no other local government function like budgeting, policing, education, childcare prioritizes public participation to the extent seen in land use. I think it's just an interesting way that we decide to handle housing, and it's interesting that we decide to handle housing sort of differently. On a broader perspective, I'll just note, I think, a little bit wishful thinking maybe, but we hope that like bringing different voices to the housing issue, like the comptrollers, in terms of like framing this as a migration issue, which it is, and really like that the deep impact it can have on our state economy. We show the lost revenue associated with this outmigration driven by cost of living. And so hopefully also like bringing different voices and different sort of angles to this issue will help. And then I think just like engaging across these different stakeholder groups, because this is so fear-based a lot of the time, and having people who, may think they'll disagree sit in one room. I always think to collaborate and try to come to consensus is always something that comes to my mind.
Great. Let's go back to the well for another audience question. I'm actually going to merge two here, and I'll provide an answer briefly so that the panelists have a chance to think of their answer. So the two questions are, in essence, can you give some examples of the Smith Island cake effect? What are some regulations that are getting in the way or conflict? Let's concretize that a bit for the audience. Getting a lot of questions about what do you mean? What does that look like? And second, what are some reforms or changes to the regulatory environment, like streamlining or permitting reforms that undoes that? So maybe if you want to think about what's one of your favorite examples of an effort or of regulation that's getting in the way of housing or undoing that. An example I'll give, and this is somewhat self-interested, is that Maryland DHCD will be introducing what we're calling starter or silver homes legislation this year to make it easier to build smaller homes in Maryland for home ownership. So whether you're beginning your career, starting your family, or you're ending your career, you need a home ownership option that you can afford. And so DHCD is working to make that possible across the state with our legislation this year. That'll reduce minimum lot sizes, and minimum lot sizes are an example of that regulation. If you say that the smallest lot that you can build on is 6,500 square feet, that forces houses to be bigger. That forces a higher price point on that housing. And so we're looking to bring down lot sizes statewide to make it easier to build starter homes for families for home ownership. That's my favorite example. So panel, what's a regulation example that's getting in the way of housing or a reform that you want to highlight?
I'll do one very quickly, and I look forward to reading that bill, Scott, the one that you just mentioned. I led this effort, the conversion of half-empty buildings into housing. So what we did is with a ZTA to make it faster, having those conversions. And two, the second part of the bill was a tax abatement to incentivize the property owner of the half-empty building to convert to housing. So that's one that just got approved by the county council.
I'm happy to jump in on a few examples that we highlighted in the report. So again, we just took an objective look at the policies that are either inhibiting developable land or raising costs. So it's not to say we have like a strong policy opinion on any of these issues, but just like really doing math and trying to quantify this as a disclaimer. So one example, we do a little comparison of Raleigh, North Carolina, and sort of the Baltimore-Towson metro area. The Maryland allows far less medium density units. Many parts of Maryland allow less medium density units compared to Raleigh. We also look at minimum parking requirements. 99% of the Baltimore-Towson metro area has minimum parking requirements. It's closer to 60% in Raleigh. Those are two examples. We also looked at adequate public facilities ordinances and impact fees, and found that while the majority of Maryland counties levy both of those policy tools, most of our neighboring states do not. So again, just something developers notice when they're sort of deciding where to develop, and or costs that can be passed on. We also look at for back to like the appeals and public input process, that it's easier to establish legal standing to appeal a housing project in Maryland compared to Delaware and Virginia. We look at a case study in the report of very similar developments taking place a few miles apart in Delaware versus a county on the Eastern Shore. And one is nearing completion and one is really just breaking ground. Delaware nearing completion, the one in Maryland just breaking ground because there's been so much more appeals and slowdowns in the Maryland project because it's easier to do that here. Finally, Scott mentioned this earlier, projects vest later in Maryland, which is important when we think about, I think, I can't remember if it was Scott or Kate mentioned the way investors view and factor into their loans for projects in Maryland, the complexity of our regulatory environment and the risk that they're taking on. So in Maryland, you have to have all your permits, construction permits, building permits, and have broken ground before a project is protected from policy change. In other states like Delaware and Virginia, for example, projects vest earlier. So once you've obtained a certain amount of permits in that process, your project is sort of locked and grandfathered in. If there was a change to density or something like that, you wouldn't have to go back and change your project blueprint, where in Maryland you would have to do that. So those are some things that came up. And then there's a lot of sort of process and timeline things too that I think the governor's executive order attempts to address. And I can talk more, but it's all in the report.
Can I just say something very quickly on parking minimums? Montgomery County, we eliminated parking minimums for new development last year. So.
And I would just say, so related to all of this, my previous life working for DC and Maryland, I was working on inclusionary zoning regulations. And we had two different, because we're in this region that has a lot of different folks. We had two different interest groups, same group, just from the different jurisdictions. Essentially, what it came down to, that the building folks were like, look, we just need to know what is going to happen so we can build it into our pro forma. Like at the end of the day, predictability really matters. And then you can make a decision. But I think that it just creates a really unpredictable environment if something changes, that changes your whole financing structure. That changes what you can build of the property. That could change the affordability of the property because you've got to you're going to have to, if the cost increases, you're going to have to find that increase somewhere. And so I think that's a really just important thing to know, is that the predictability ultimately matters for a strong construction community.
Yeah, I'll just give that a +1 because I think we heard that more than anything in our community engagement with developers, and they're all sort of tied together because, the more you're allowed to appeal a project, the longer you can delay a timeline, the more likely it is that land use policy will have changed, the more likely it is you'll have to go back to the drawing board. And then, let's say density was reduced for that project or in that area and a project has to adapt, it may no longer math out. And then it's been 3 years and millions of dollars have been spent and now the project's no longer viable. So the sort of connection and cycle that can start was commonly cited.
Great. And I think we have time for one more question from the audience. So this one we saw quite a bit is, can you talk about missing middle housing? So, we often see the only types of housing that are being built these days are detached single family homes in subdivisions versus large multifamily developments. But there's many folks don't know, but there's a wide spectrum of housing that is single family attached or cottage clusters or townhomes or, all the way up to, mid-rise and, smaller stick-built communities. So what's getting in the way of building middle housing right now? Why aren't we seeing more of that? Why isn't there anything besides large multifamily and detached single family being built? What do we need in order to encourage that? A related question, is the notion that in that space of middle housing, we could get smaller developers, we could get factory built housing, just some other contributors to the housing production pipeline. So why are we not seeing missing middle housing? What would it take to get it going here?
We just approved that a few months ago. And
so we're done. We're good.
No, well, I mentioned it a few minutes ago. It's called the Housing Now proposal that Councilmember Andrew Fitson and I led. highly controversial. So we ended up doing it and allowing duplexes and triplexes, missing middle, as you're saying, in particular places in the county. There is a, it has to be places near transit with wide streets and so forth. Um, People can start building them today if they want to, if your property qualifies. So now, if you have a home and you need to redevelop, your only option is not to create a Mac mansion. Now you have an option to create a duplex or triplex, a small apartment unit if your property is in one of those locations. I have heard from quite a few people who told me that they're looking forward to actually start applying for this, and I can't wait. That's progress. I wish it was countywide, but it's, we didn't have a vote for that one. So we were very specific in places that are pretty much near transit to make them happen. So.
Um, so the thing is about missing middle, right? So, missing middle requires, I mean, I think that, well, I guess the root of this, you can open up land and get to missing middle. That's one of those things. People will sometimes be like, oh, we need to subsidize it. We need to subsidize it. But like part of this really is about getting it to a median value. I think though we have to be really careful about what we expect. I know I'm the poo-pooer here of all things. But it is hard to build these and right. And like, so you have to, because, if you're doing a 4-unit building, for example, you decide to do a quadplex. Well, so 4-unit buildings, what does that become? It's a condo, maybe, if you do home ownership. But 4 units is really hard to run a condo. And so it can be really challenging and it may or may not actually pencil, especially if you have to go through a long process. And you could say, well, I could build a multi-million-dollar house instead. But so I think we have to be really careful and we have to figure out how do we reduce the friction, whether that's reducing the time that it takes to get through, because, if you've got somebody who actually doesn't really want to do this and they may sort of try to put up some roadblocks to a fourplex, that increases your time. And then that makes this a much less predictable process. So I do think but I think that the way for missing middle, whether that is fourplexes or whether that is townhomes, whether that is small apartments, missing middle essentially is market rate housing for people who are at the median income, right? Most rental housing, fun enough, is market for rental housing is at about 80% of area median income, because the median income includes homeowners living out in the agricultural preserve and renters living in Ward 8 in DC. And so you ultimately merge all of those things. And so your rental price is about 80% median income. And you should be able to actually get to that by opening up land.
Any last word?
Yeah, I had a slide that I took out for the sake of time, so I'll just sort of go back to it and look at my notes here. When I showed the permitting data, we did in the report zoom in on multifamily and medium density as like a subset of our overall supply data, and we see that Maryland lags even further behind on smaller multifamily buildings in particular. For duplexes, I'm a proud duplex owner. We, well, one half of a duplex. We have the lowest rate of permitting per 1,000 residents for duplexes in Maryland compared to all the other states in that cohort. So for me and in the report, it seems to be a lot about zoning. We have a really interesting graph on page 38, which shows medium density zoning by county. With a few exceptions, it's less than 30%. It makes up sort of less than 30% of allowable of zoning in each county. And I'll just, to give one more specific example, like I did earlier, in Baltimore, Columbia, Towson, 30% of residential land allows for duplexes. In Durham, Chapel Hill, North Carolina, 86% of land allows for duplexes. So, I mean, yeah, I think a lot of it's about zoning. I think also, to Kate's point, it's about making the math work. So lowering, making it a little, streamlining it, making it cheaper and easier to build that type of housing on top of making it even allowed in the first place would all help, I would think.
agreed.
Great. So that's it for the time that we have for the panel. I want to say thank you so much to the panelists. I'm going to throw it back over to Cheryl in just a second. But I just want to point out that all four of the folks, moderator and the three panelists that are here today, work in government, and we can make government work. The folks who are on the panel and myself share a deep commitment to being data-driven and heart-led, to looking at the data, listening to constituents. What is the lived reality of the world telling us? Not ideologically, but what are the facts saying about what we need to do to address this crisis? What's the data showing about the lived experience of residents in our community and those that are leaving our community because they can't afford to live here anymore? So I hope you all will join me in thanking our panelists who are making government work for you. And I'll throw it back over now to Cheryl from the Coalition for Smarter Growth.
Well, I think we'd have a big round of applause. There we go. Thank you so much. This panel was wonderful. I really appreciate everybody's insight. I thought it brought great perspective. And I want to thank Assistant Secretary Scott Gopret for doing such a great job of moderating. And I want to encourage folks to look out for emails from us about upcoming events and opportunities to learn more, to get engaged. And in fact, next week, December 16th, we have a terrific event that we're doing online called Beyond Luxury: How New Housing Helps Affordability in Our Region, with a soon-to-be famous YouTuber and local elected official, Justine Underhill. She's a local city council member in Falls Church, Virginia, but her YouTube broadcasting it sends me national, and so we're going to basically take really fantastic national material in terms of her communications around the issues that we're talking about and bringing them to our region. And I really recommend you join us for that event. I've heard her speak last week, and she's just amazing. And so, with that, I want to thank again the panelists and thank everyone for joining us. And we look forward to continuing this conversation. I just wanted to ask Carrie if there's anything I forgot that you want to.
Yeah, I think Scott, Cheryl, you said it all. I'm really grateful for everyone who came out today. This was outstanding. And I just wanted to add that if you enjoy this programming, if you appreciate what CSG does, we have an end of year campaign right now where some of our generous donors have offered a match. So if you donate to us before the end of the year, it will be twice the donation. Elena just shared that link in the chat, but we do really appreciate your support so we can keep running great programming like this.
Great. Well, with that, thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.